as well. So we'd like to welcome you to the show. And if you're one of a million people who are yearning to become a DNA detective, this show is for you today. We welcome our guest, Dr. Trish Varner, psychologist who hosts Life with Dr. Trish Varner on numerous social media sites. Good afternoon and welcome to the show, Dr. Trish.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here with you again.
Now, tell me about your psychology background. How did you get started, and how long have you had your degree, and how has that degree helped you in doing work in genealogy?
Well, first, let me start off by saying I've been researching genealogy probably for over 20 years now. So before I even became Dr. Trish, I was digging into family trees and just gathering all the information that I could find because I've always had an interest in it, right? So I think I've been doing that longer than I've been studying psychology, but my PhD is in general psychology, and I have an emphasis on industrial and organizational psychology, which, to summarize it, in many ways, it can be used to understand the psychology of groups in the workplace, out of the workplace, amongst individuals, and how they interact with each other, and just basically to provide a better understanding of that.
It's so interesting because when I first discovered you online several years ago, a coworker that I used to work with had a video out, and you actually produced that video on his life, and who he thought was his parents turned out really not to be his parents. His name was Freddie Red. Everybody listening probably knows that. But just briefly, that story, what piqued your interest in doing Freddie Red's interview and story about his life?
Well, when I heard about his story, what was fascinating is the fact that he didn't know much about his birth family initially, and it was all coming from one hospital. And it's been a few years since I've done that story. However, it's still very popular on my channel. And, even after publicizing that story, so many people reached out and said, hey, I have that similar story from that same location, from the same hospital. And I think it just opened up so many doors, and it helped people to really understand that they too can find out who their birth parents are, because even when individuals have awesome, amazing adoptive parents, when they were loved and supported and cared for, and they lived in a great home, they still often have that interest in finding out where they came from. I think that's a natural interest within us to really understand, what are our roots. I think that's something that really calls out in us to understand that. And it's not anything that's going against who raised you. It's the fact that everyone should be able to understand where their biological roots come from. So that story, I still, even today, I get so many comments about how amazing his story is. First of all, they just love him, and he's easy to love anyway, right? Because I'm sure he just speaks well. He's very charismatic, and that's still a very popular story.
Yeah, for people whose lives, like he grew up in a very prominent family, his father, Dr. Passett, everybody knew him in Cincinnati area. And he just knew that was his family, but then he found out it wasn't. But it didn't change his course in life, but he did find out who his birth parents were. So that can happen for a lot of people. People sometimes who are adopted have a real need to find out who they're connected with.
Absolutely. And I think even people who know who their parents are, and maybe they don't fully know or understand their grandparents' story or their great grandparents, or even maybe going back further than that, they still have that curiosity. They want to know, are there other people who are like me? Do they look like me? Do they act like me? Where did I get this particular talent? For instance, they may be a great singer or a dancer, or are there other individuals in the family who love that? And I think everyone is looking for that connection of where they belong.
Indeed, making our history come alive. And I think that this show is for people who are interested and want to become DNA detectives. So that's what we're talking about today. Uh, if you see the show, like it and share it. Let people know that we're on the air live with Dr. Trish Varner, and we're talking about researching your family history and making you more aware of who you are. I think that it's really important for our listeners to also know that no matter what our family origin is, hmm, there's something out there that we all don't know about our family. Or is it based on, I think my sister may not be my sister because she's lighter than me. Or she's got red hair and I don't. What really proves who's connected and who's related?
Well, I'm a mother of daughters. One has, well, my younger ones, I have two adult daughters, but the younger ones, one has black hair and one has red hair. And it's not uncommon for us to hear, oh, do they have the same parents? Are they both biological siblings? Yes, they are. DNA is so fascinating, right? You never know exactly what you're going to get. It's so diverse, especially within the Black American community. I think we hear a lot of times the light skin, dark skin thing, and we know as Black people that you can't look at someone and really say who they belong to or how are they related. That's not always the case. Sometimes you can, but in my situation and in many other people's situation, you absolutely cannot. And sometimes those DNA secrets will come out too that you may not have been aware of. I get a lot of that as also. I've had situations where where individuals find out their father may not have been their biological father. I've had a situation where a young woman was raised to believe she was white by two white parents, even though us looking in, we're like, how could that even be possible? She's obviously mixed with some type of Black. But yet there it was, she really believed that into adulthood until a DNA test told her otherwise. So DNA, I like to say, it will not lie. It will tell family secrets.
All right. We have our chat line is open. And if you have a question or a chat or a comment, like C Love checked in from Atlanta. Greetings from the ATL. She says, thank you, Dr. Varner, for sharing with us the importance of our family DNA. So thank you, C Love. We appreciate that. If you have a chat question or comment for Dr. Varner, you can join us on the chat line as well. Thank you again. Right here on Issues and Opinions Straight Talk Live with your host. I'm Edna Howell-Parrish and our guest, Trish Varner. Now, it's so interesting that some of the comments that we have from people that are doing some things online. Now, as a genealogist once said, once you start your DNA testing and questioning, there's a lot you have to look out for. Now, let's talk about the families who say, well, my grandmother or my cousin, she had hair down her back. So that said, we got Indian in our family because they didn't have a nappy kitchen in the back. We got Indian in our family because we got so-called good hair. Okay.
I hate that saying, but
don't you hate it? But that's
yes.
what people say. They have Indian in their family. So is there really Indian in everyone's family? Let's take a listen.
Who are the ancestors of African Americans? Well, most African Americans believe that the majority of their DNA has roots in Africa, while the remaining has roots in Native American tribes and Europe. This is often backed by genetic studies that reveal that African Americans have 73.2% African DNA, 24% European DNA, and 0.8% Native American DNA. This makes everyone believe that they are majorly descendants of Black slaves. But what if we tell you that it's wrong? You have been intentionally told so. In fact, studies reveal that about 98% of African Americans have Native American roots. So, why were you lied to and what do they want to hide?
I would like to see those studies.
So what do you think about that? Why are they lying to us or why are we being lied to? If we
on my channel, I see people all the time who say, we're not descendants from Africa. We are the original indigenous people. I'm not denying that our we have some indigenous American ancestry. I'm not denying that. But I think to say that we have no African ancestry, that's a major stretch to me. And I know they say they have proof. I would like to see the studies that they're referencing there, because I have not come across any reliable studies. I know there's a lot of podcasts out there who like to say, they have their facts and the information they pull up, but a lot of that is hearsay. And I know, when looking at the DNA itself. Go ahead. Uh-oh, did we get cut off?
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. You were frozen a little bit.
Company that runs the
but
all the interference. So just continue on to talk.
I'm not one of those who happen to believe that all Black Americans have indigenous American roots. I'm not one of those. I know there are plenty of people out there who believe that, but I go by facts and the research that I've done and the research that is out there that's readily available. And although I know that there are Black Americans with Native American roots, I think a lot of times it does not show in our DNA.
So interesting. So if you're listening and you have Indian in your family, or you've been told that you do, or you look at pictures and see people with nice hair and feathers and whatever, and family pictures, give us a call. We'd like to hear from you. But I'm looking at my ancestry results. My sister had our DNA done, and on the girl's side, it says that in the last one, we have 1% Native American. It has it actually on here now. So that's 1%. So I don't know. But my brother's side, he doesn't have any Indian on his DNA chart. So,
I think that 1%. If I didn't check this before I joined, but if I remember correctly, I think that can go back 6 or 7 generations. Mm-hmm. So, and we also need to keep in mind that, because you mentioned that your brother doesn't show any in his DNA. Well, what we're actually showing in our DNA isn't a full representative of every ancestor that we've always had, right? And not only that, but siblings can inherit different percentages of DNA. We don't inherit the same DNA from our parents. We get 50% from each parent, but what 50% are we getting? My brother may get a different DNA than I may have inherited from my parents, because it's just that's how diverse it is. And also keep in mind, that's how oftentimes within families we're looking different, right? So I have an interesting story though. I am one of those that initially I didn't have any detectable Native American ancestry. Through updates with Ancestry.com, it now shows 1% Native American ancestry, which is right along. I'm literally the typical example of what they're saying. I think I'm about 75, or no, the latest result, 74% African, and like 25 or so percent European, and 1% Native American. So I'm the typical, according to studies, I'm the typical Black American. But interesting, there's a book that a grandson of a former slave owner wrote, and come to find out that the family that he wrote about in that book is my maternal line. And in that book, he mentions that one of the women looked mostly Native American. So, and she happened to be my great grandmother. So I think it's just interesting that although in this book, and even though they said that she looked mostly Native American, there's a good chance that she could have also had other races within her.
Indeed.
Yeah, so that could be one of the reasons why my detectable Native American percentage isn't as high as it could be. And then also it's because it's been several generations. But I think there's no denying that my family did have at least one Native American ancestor.
And then I know in on my mother's side, my maternal side, I know that my mother's mother, great grandmother was, had they did have Indian. Drusilla Creech was her name, and so the Creech family, they were from, were part Native American. But on the DNA now, if my sister has DNA, would I have she have the same thing that I would have? Would we have the same thing, same percentages of,
I mean,
or would it be
not
different?
necessarily. Most of the time it is different. And also because we have to keep in mind that with these DNA tests, they're doing estimates, right? They're doing estimates
Right.
and they're comparing your DNA to people who are now living in these other countries. Um, so no, siblings will not have the same DNA percentages. I don't have the same as my brother. We oftentimes will have similar, but no, we won't show the same. Even twins won't necessarily show the same percentages at times, and it may be because of a variety of reasons. They may be taking their DNA test from a different DNA company, right? Because different DNA companies will analyze your DNA using different methods, right? Different DNA tests won't come out with the same results every time. So, yeah, we need to keep that in mind that these are estimates and that it's not just exact science, but especially for Black Americans, it really helps to uncover so much about us that we didn't have so many generations ago, right? It helps to
Right.
answer so many questions.
Well, so now my brother, I had three brothers. Two are passed away, and then the one that's left over, that's the one that we did the test on. Now he had at the top of his list, he had 20% Ivory Coast, Ghana. And then my sister had 21% at the top of her list for Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Um, but my brother in his for Scotland and Wales, Ireland, he had 13%, she had 21%. So it's all different, mixed up. It's really interesting in here. So we kind of see where things go, but we have learned a lot from it. But it's really interesting to get
Yeah,
this information. Very
right.
interesting. So we move
Yeah,
on.
so
Go ahead.
no, I was just saying because yeah, whenever you're trying to estimate your percentage of ancestry from different countries, you're going to find those differences. But one thing we do know, even though those are estimates, what we do know is DNA won't lie. So I've come across so many situations where people will match to someone they never even knew was in their family. And they're doing this through these genetic testing sites, right? I've had a couple of situations that happened to me. One, I matched to a young lady who contacted me, and come to find out my grandfather had another child that no one knew about. And and her mother and my mother were half sisters. Her mother has since passed away. And then she and I are first cousins. So I've lived this whole life not knowing she existed, and she didn't know I existed. But I'm here to tell you, oftentimes you have to be ready to take those DNA tests because it's going to uncover some things that sometimes people don't want to know.
Interesting. And speaking of that, what about our oral history? Those stories that you might have been a little girl sitting around and your mom and dad were talking to her sisters and aunts were talking, and they started telling these little stories, and you kind of kept them in your brain in the back. And are these stories really important? Can they be true? And how would you find out if they really were true?
Absolutely. Oral history is so very important. I wouldn't discount that or discredit it in any situation. Sometimes it may be the first thing that you have to go by. What I mean by that is if you want to start your family tree and you want to start the search of your family history, the first thing you may have to go by is your family's oral history. And that's good to have. And then you could take that information. For instance, maybe part of the oral history is a family originated from Virginia or some other place, or maybe they know that there was an ancestor that came from Ireland. You can use that oral history to really start digging into more of your family history and just being able to expand your family tree that way. I think oral history is very important.
Great. Have you heard any stories from some of your people who you've done, traced their family backgrounds from that you thought were very interesting?
Well, yeah. So lately I've been trying. Well, let me just start off by saying this. I have a list currently of over 100 requests from my viewers who want me to do a family tree, mainly on celebrities, right? And I'm trying to get through that list, right? It's a massive list right now. And one of the things people ought to know is when you start going down these rabbit holes, it can take up quite a bit of your time. So it's taken some time to get to, but of course I've had interesting finds. There was I did the OJ Simpson tree and found where one of his ancestors had a similar situation as he was accused of. If you haven't seen that video, go check it out. It's very, very interesting. And some people even say it could be strange because we're seeing history repeat itself.
But our family of origin, it does have an effect sometimes on how our life could turn out. I mean, it just wasn't by coincidence. Do you think that's in your DNA if you would be an unaliver type person, a KILLER type person?
I don't know if it's necessarily in our DNA, but what I do believe is that some things attach to you that carry on from generation to generation. And if you're a spiritual person, some people may say that is a form of a generational curse. Other people may think it's just learned behavior. However you see it, I do see in stories where certain things are repeating itself within families. And oftentimes it's with family members they didn't even know existed. This is why it's so important, I believe, to really dig into your family tree and understand who these people are. Because a lot of those things that they encountered, someone in your family or maybe you yourself will encounter too.
All right, our chat line is open. We have another chat with Dr. John H. McClendon III. He said, very good point about oral history by Dr. Varner. He said, insightful. And thank you, Edna. Hey, John, thank you so much for checking in. John really is on top of a lot of information. He is really a special guest and always been on my show. So he kind of likes what you said, Dr. Trish.
Well, that's great because oral history is very good to have. Sometimes it's hard to substantiate, though, depending upon, because oftentimes they may have certain facts right in the oral history, right? But there's always something that's just not quite aligning. But, it's a good starting point to have. So, and I think it's important to carry on. One of the things I'm really working on, too, for my future generations, I don't want them just to rely on oral history, but my plan is to have everything written down so that we can pass it from generation to generation so that we can tell our own stories in our own words and our future generations can have that from us. I think that's important. We're living in a time now where we're able to do that. But in previous generations, that may have been more difficult. But I really want to take that oral history and just make sure everything is as documented as possible. I remember as a little girl in 4th or 5th grade, when my teacher, of course, most of my teachers were white women, and they didn't understand how broken it was for Black people to be able to research their family trees. And we had a project where we had to research our family tree. And I couldn't go past my grandparents. Can you believe that? And when I asked my parents the information, they didn't have the information for me. And I felt that it was so embarrassing for me as a young child, not to have the history of my family, where I would look at my white classmates and they were going back for hundreds of years, and I couldn't go past my grandparents. And it was so frustrating for me. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why it really I developed that real strong interest in finding my identity and making sure it's documented. I wanted to make sure that my children never would have to go through that. And so I want to make sure the future generations, they have the information they need as well.
I can remember the same thing when I was in elementary school. There were still a lot of white children going to our elementary. And so whenever, St. Patrick's Day would come, this one girl, Virginia Stewart, I'll never forget her. She would wear her plaid skirt, and she would tell a story about this, our family origin from Scotland or somewhere, and this was the plaid that was part of the family, history of that same plaid. And I'm saying, well, how does she know that? And what do we have that we could cling on to that could never had anything like that until I got older. And then Kenneth Combs, who I said was a cousin, Crystal's father, did research, and they found that my great grandmother was from Benin, Africa, and when she came to America, she made a quilt. Not only did she make the quilt, she carded wool and made the quilt. And so this is documented, and it was in the Smithsonian Institute. So I know that for a fact. In fact, I'm going to show that because I happen to have it right here. And here she is. This is Louisa Frances Combs, and the quilt is down below. And that's her husband. That's my great grandmother and my great grandfather. So Crystal's father kept that information, and so we know that to be documented. So I could show that quilt. I would be somebody today. I am somebody, right. But definitely would be really worth it to have something like that. So we do have it. So Crystal definitely is on top of it and working on getting that family history out there.
Yeah, I love it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, John. I appreciate you checking in. And John's getting ready to have a celebration for the history of Ghana's freedom. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in our show. Also, when it comes to DNA and who we are, I really think that it's so interesting to find out about Dr. Henry Louis Gates. He's the king of DNA testing, I'll call him that. But it's interesting, we talked about Native Americans, and the Pocahontas, the infamous Indian, helped the Pilgrims in Jamestown, the beginning colony, and she helped to save the life of so-called story, this for history, but history in fact, that she helped to save the life of Captain John Smith. And he fell in love with her. She was a young girl, but he took her back to Europe. And so they celebrated her. He wanted her to be celebrated, saying, this is how the savages have been tamed. And she's a great person, and they wanted to get money for Jamestown. So put the story out there. But here is someone who they trace to have this group that belonged to Pocahontas.
Pocahontas is indeed your 12th great-grandmother.
Oh, my God.
I understand that was family lore. Well, it is absolutely true.
And how could you possibly determine that?
Through the paper trail.
It would have been documented, their paper trail of their children.
Of course. John Rolfe and Pocahontas got married on April 5th, 1614. Shakespeare dies in 1616, just put this in perspective.
Married in North America, or he had taken her back to...
No, in Jamestown, Virginia. Pocahontas died sometime in March 1617 in Gravesend, England.
England, right.
And John Rolfe died around March 1622.
So they were married in 1614.
1614, when Shakespeare was still alive. But you have a direct paper trail, no doubt about it, connection to your 12th great-grandmother and great-grandfather, John Rolfe and Pocahontas.
This is about as far back as you can go.
It's as far back as you can go.
That's it, unless you're a Viking.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, how about that? 12th great-grandmother.
Yeah. That's an awesome find. Yeah, very interesting.
Yes. I know the story. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that it's interesting that Dr. Gates, he did mention that the paper trail, because sometimes the paper trail can also look different than the DNA trail. And, one of the things I want to mention is if there is a way to trace your matrilineal line, and so that would be your mother's going back for thousands of generations. That X chromosome is going to be the same. That's inherited from daughter to daughter to daughter. So I actually did do that test, and it traced my line back to Africa. So my maternal line does go back to Africa, but my paternal line, which I personally couldn't do because I don't have a Y chromosome, of course, and women can't trace that from their own DNA. But if you have a sibling on your dad's side, or perhaps an uncle, or maybe even your dad, there are certain tests that you can take that will trace your paternal line. And my paternal line points back to Ireland. So anyway, I say that too, because sometimes the paper trail, as we know, what's the saying? Mama's baby, daddy's maybe, that people like to say. But sometimes the paper trail won't always match with what the DNA ends up showing. But yeah, it's all fascinating stuff to have.
Families of origin. I can think back to my mother and father telling these oral history stories, and so I found out like my mother and my father are double related, meaning that my mother's uncle, great uncle, and my father's great aunt were married. So they were a combination of the Arnett family and the Combs family. And a lot of people find it so interesting now. They didn't know that, they were my aunt and uncle, but they knew they were married, but they didn't know how the relationship went. So I think that a lot of people understand that when people get married, I even have cousins who marry second cousins. So I know it's illegal. Isn't it illegal to marry like a first cousin, or is that just?
It depends on the state, honestly. But yeah, so that's actually not uncommon, especially if you're coming from smaller towns. That may happen, and so surprisingly though, DNA shows that, and I know a lot of people still will say, I would never do that, and I wouldn't either. No one's interested in marrying their cousin. But anyway, whenever cousins do marry, the likelihood of having some type of offspring with a disability is very, very low when cousins do, because it's the diversity of the DNA that happens there. But so anyway, but it's not actually all that shocking when you see that in people's family trees. I've seen family trees where you start to see one line. It's just interconnecting with one another. And that's because perhaps on your mother and father's line, if you go back far enough, they descended from the same ancestors.
Exactly. And I think that was one of the stories that Crystal's father talks about. In the story, he talks about, our family, that we're my mother's family, Combs family, but he said we're originated from Combs and then Cornets and then Olingers, 3 families that are connected. And so somehow they're all related but intermarried. So I know my grandmother was an Olinger, but then, she was a Combs, but then her husband was a Combs. So I don't know. It's really...
Well, and you and I talked about this before the show, and I committed to you. I said, I'm going to have to do some digging into the Combs family tree and to see how you're related to Sean Combs. If you want to be. I don't know. Sometimes we don't want to be related to certain people, but it is what it is, right?
Right. But I don't mind sharing that. We're talking about P. Diddy Combs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know that he is in our family. A lot of cousins said, well, no, we're not, but yeah, we are. And so I know that. Yeah. So when I went online searching today, I found a piece that said this was P. Diddy's ancestry, story. but then of course it's missing. Now it was there, it's there in name, but it's blank. So somebody has taken it down. So I don't know who it was, what it was. But yeah, definitely. And we always say you can't go by how someone looks to say they're related, but he sure looks like the male relatives in my cousins and
just like him, huh?
They look just alike. So
yeah,
could be something there. So we shall see.
When you go digging into your family tree, you got to be ready for anything. You can't control who you're going to be related to. Everyone in your family tree isn't going to be good, and since a lot of times when putting together a family tree, you may not even be able to find any extra story about them. You may only be able to find their name and birth date. But one thing that I like to pull up, especially I really like to use Ancestry.com because it's one of the largest databases when it comes to DNA research. And it also connects to newspaper articles and things that, maybe have happened many decades ago. And sometimes if you do a search on your relative, you're able to come across an article. You may find where perhaps they got into some legal trouble, or maybe you'll find an announcement of a marriage or a birth of a baby. So and I love when I come across stories like that because it really gives more information about how that person lived. And it's not just a name and perhaps a picture. Even having a picture, sometimes it can be hard to find. But I really love it when stories come together.
For people that are interested, I would advise you to go to Dr. Trish Varner's Facebook page, go to her YouTube page. She has some of the most interesting stories and histories of families that she has traced. And I know you have a lot on who's black and who's not black. J. Edgar Hoover. Now, how did you find out that information? That he's black? People say, no, not him, no.
Lately, a lot of my stories come from my viewers. They give me what they've heard, the rumors they've heard, and I start going down rabbit holes to see what I can find out there, what I can find on the DNA sites, what I can find online, what I can find just in any archives, just anything, And so that's why I'm careful about what rumor I take on, because it could take a lot of my time. It could take several weeks. So, and I'm one of those that really likes to solve mysteries. So if I know this is going to take me quite a bit of time, I'm really careful about what story I'm going to start digging into.
DNA detective, that's what I call you. DNA detective. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, African American. They really looked like they were white, but when you checked in that background, his mother was African American.
I mean, that picture, it doesn't lie. There's nothing in the paper trail that will say yes for sure she was, but that's not necessarily unheard of, because it's not something they want to be known, right? But you're looking at that picture and she's looking like a lot of biracial people that we know of today. And you're looking at that and you're like, there is no doubt that there is something there.
So people that are looking for, trying to trace their DNA, find out who their family members are, what's the first thing that you would suggest that they do in terms of starting their research? Do they just jump out there and start looking on websites, or what do they do?
One of the first things I would recommend, go talk to your living relatives, especially the older ones. You don't know how long they're going to be with us. Oftentimes they have a wealth of information. Okay. One of the things I was upset about is I found out when I was about 10 that I had living great grandparents I had never met. And I asked my mother, why didn't you take me over there to speak to my great grandparents? I was a different kind of child. I was that kind of child that wanted my family history. she didn't feel like it was important at the time. But I'm like, I would have loved to have talked with them and heard about how they lived and, you know, how they were as children and how life was for them. So I think it's so important to today go call up your oldest living relative and let them talk as long as they want to about their life, their family's life, the lives of people around them, because it's so important to have that information. And then also what you're gathering is you're going to end up getting a lot of the oral history about your family. Then you're able to take that information you received and go digging more. You can then go, and because we're living in a digital age, everything is digital and online at this point, it seems like. I personally use ancestry.com a lot. There are other sites you can go out there and build a family tree. But I find that there's a lot of information out there. There are the census reports, birth certificates, marriage certificates. There are newspaper articles. There are even school yearbooks. So there's a lot of things you can dig into. But what I would do after speaking with your oldest living relative, start writing down names and birth dates. You're going to need that. So find out who your grandparents are if you don't know. And then also your great-grandparents, if they're aware of that. Usually, if you have the names of your parents, your grandparents, and if you're lucky, your great-grandparents, then that's going to open up so many doors for you digitally online, and it becomes a lot easier to research your tree from that point. That has to be a starting point. Then so start plugging in those names, the names and birth dates. And then guess what? Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold here.
That's okay.
But if sometimes if there's even a relative that you're not even aware of, if they have your family member in their tree, you may get a tree hint in Ancestry that basically says, this is a match to someone else's family tree. Would you like to compare information? So then you can look at their information to see if that's the same person that should be in your tree. I would recommend don't just accept it right away. You have to do your research, because sometimes the information may be inaccurate and you don't want to build an inaccurate family tree. But if the name matches, the location, the birth date, who they were married to, who their children are, because even in those census reports, you'll start being able to trace them from decade to decade. For instance, the 1870 census may show a family and may list children there. And then the 1880 census, you can look for that family again, and so on. And you can just trace them from generation to generation. I would really start there. And it then becomes less overwhelming for you, because a lot of times people don't understand where to start. But you start with your known information. Start with that. Start there.
Well, Trish, how far back do the census records go as far as African Americans are concerned? And how many years can they go back, and how many years are census published?
Well, it depends. So, okay, so we're talking about here enslaved people and free people of color. So free people of color, it depends at what point they gained their freedom. It may go back for several years before 1870, but a lot of times you won't see enslaved individuals included in the census reports until 1870. And that's because that was the first census report after the Emancipation Proclamation. So usually you'll start seeing them there. But if your ancestors are enslaved and you want to try to dig before 1870 and they were not free people of color, then you're going to come across a challenge. And what you'll have to dig into are slave schedules and property records, deeds, because sadly, Black Americans were listed as property if they come from an enslaved background. And from there, you're going to be able to, you have to really look into the families who owned these individuals, who enslaved these individuals, and see if perhaps their information that they have in their deeds and such match with the information that you have.
So interesting. And then a lot of, back in the day, a lot of courthouses caught fire. A lot of records I know were destroyed. So sometimes you hit a brick wall and you just can't go any further. Or can you?
Absolutely. Sometimes you will hit a brick wall. But the good news is that you might hit a brick wall on one particular line, but the more you go back, you're going to see multiple lines, right? So you start out with 2 parents, then you have 4 grandparents, then you have 8 great grandparents, and all of them are going to have different lines that you can go. So if you receive a roadblock in one line, keep digging in another line, and a lot of times you'll be able to go back much further than what you really thought you could, and I know for me, I've gone back. Let's just say my family's been here for a very long time. So I'm one of those foundational Black Americans that were here prior to the Civil War, even going back, some lines going back to the 1700s. So it's fascinating information to be able to pass down to my children, coming from someone back in 5th grade where I only knew my grandparents, to now being able to trace lines back hundreds of years. I think we've come a long way, and I'm not the exception. For anyone who's watching, you are able to do that too. Now it may take up some of your time, but it's possible to do it, and it's very fulfilling.
I know my mother's side, we have pretty much covered the gamut of their family history, but my father's side, I never knew a lot about them because he never liked to talk about it. His mom was white, his dad was Black. His dad was killed and shot by some people in the coal mining town in Kentucky because he was married to a white woman. So he never got to know his dad. But the white families that he was around, he had a love for them, but somehow they didn't, I'll use the word cotton to Black, him and his sister. They treated him pretty bad, but he never talked about them. But what he had in the family Bible, he had the names of my grandmother, great grandmother. We had all these photographs in the album. And lo and behold, when he passed away, I just got curious and started searching, trying to find his father. Couldn't find a thing, but I knew he had an aunt who he always talked about. He had an Aunt Monty. And I thought she lived in one town in Portsmouth, but I found out later on, years later, that she lived in another town in Northern Ohio. I called the library. I found out and got her obituary. And there was my father's name and all the people that were his relatives, and found out where my father got his name from, one of the ladies in the family. And so it opened up a whole new world for me, finding his family. And then I had a genealogist to help me to trace the rest of the family. So I never thought I would, but it could, but it did. So it's really important to find that story, and then to know, because I knew who my grandmother was. I was named after her. I knew who my great-grandmother was. I saw her once in my life. But then I have a third great-great-grandmother who we have pictures of, these strange people. But they all go back, and so we know them. And it all came from Black Mary, who was a slave woman who was impregnated by their owner, Reuben Arnett. So there it goes. So I know where that goes. So you have to really be patient and tenacious and stick with it to be able to uncover a lot of information.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought this up too, because I wanted to mention early on in my research and on my channel, and when sharing my family's stories publicly, people will say, well, how can you be 74% African and have all this European DNA, 25%, and you don't have any recent European ancestors? We get that all the time. They're so unaware of how that happens. Well, that's most of Black America, right? When doing my research, I don't have any close European relatives. All of my European ancestry came prior to the Civil War. And my ancestors were enslaved. What does this indicate? This indicates that, and especially since my maternal line points back to Africa, but my paternal line points back to Europe. This indicates, and research has shown, that overwhelmingly enslaved women were impregnated by the European men who were around them, right? That could be the slave owners. It could be perhaps the overseer. It could be they were taken advantage of often. And I know there are some people out there who say, well, you can't prove that. That could have been a consensual relationship. Well, I don't know how consensual a relationship can be when the person is enslaved and you don't have the power to give your consent. That's called abuse of power. Whenever there's a situation where there's a power imbalance, I think then the individual who is not in power is very much so getting taken advantage of. So in my history, I know everyone's story may be different, but in my history, my lines show I didn't have any recent European ancestry. I'm one of those foundational Black Americans, pre-Civil War Black Americans, where all of my mixed ancestry comes during the time of enslavement. And I think that's really not too uncommon. Really, it's not uncommon at all for the Black American experience.
The story I shared last week on Issues and Opinions was with Shannon Lanier, who is the 16th great-grandson of former President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had a relationship, impregnated Sally Hemings. She had 6 children. In fact, maybe two girls and 6 boys. But Shannon is a relative, and his mother always told him and his brother the story or history. But I knew him very well. But he told the story, and eventually it came out, and where he shared with Monticello and how the Blacks went to meet their white relatives, and the white relatives didn't like it, and on and on and on. But eventually they settled because DNA proved that they were relatives. So did Sally Hemings consent? Well, she went to Europe with Thomas Jefferson. He took her with him. She was a younger woman. And in fact, she was the slave sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife. So there you go. That's when white men could have two wives, a Black one and a white one. Slave.
Yeah, it wasn't uncommon.
No.
In fact, I did a story last month of President Jimmy Carter's family lines, and his family lines go back to slavery as well, where they were massive slave owners. They owned lots of slaves. If you ever look up the Carter surname, you will see that roughly about 35% of the individuals with the last name Carter are Black individuals. And it's because of the massive number of enslaved people they had. Anyway, come to find out that in his line, there was, I believe it was maybe his second great-grandfather. I don't recall right off the top of my head. But he actually got his enslaved girl pregnant. She was 14 at the time. And she ended up having a child that became the grandfather of Berry Gordy. So President Jimmy Carter and Berry Gordy were second cousins. And that's a pretty close relation right there. And it's because of that situation where one of his forefathers impregnated that young slave girl. Can a 14-year-old girl give consent, especially an enslaved girl, give consent to a grown adult man who has power over her? In my opinion, no. But it is what it is. And so their generations after them, they are related.
Interesting. So when you're doing your research, so you go on Ancestry.com or LegacyTree.com or AfricanAncestry.com and you see a family tree, you start to fill it out. And you say, oh, well, that's why you get grandmother and you get uncle. And then you think, okay, well, this is my third cousin. I heard her name before, and you click on it and you put that in there and you start doing that. Then you kind of get mixed up, maybe. One thing that we have to remember that you have to be careful. So that's one of thing that this genealogist reminded us.
Hi, I'm Akosua E. Moore, a lead genealogist for Finding Your Roots, here to answer the question, what should I be cautious of when researching my lineage using online search platforms? When researching using online platforms, beware of connecting your ancestors to trees or trees of other users. The main problem with this is the documents, for example, census records, that they have linked may not be your ancestor. It is best to write down the user and tree name to use as a reference. Continue to search as you have been, looking for solid connections to documents they have sourced. Make sure you pay attention to every detail. I have seen user trees that have incorrect documents linked simply because they did not pay attention to the race, birth year, or location of the ancestor. Happy hunting.
That is so true. Let me tell you that when I tell you that is so true. So recently I was going in, just checking some things on my family tree, and my mother, who's still living, some hints came up for my mother. And obviously I know my mother's information, right? And it was pulling up some information instead of Galbraith, it was showing Gilbreth. The first name was correct. The birth date was similar, but instead of a G-A-L, it had a G-I-L. And maybe if I had not known her, maybe I would have said, oh, well, that's close enough, and added that hint to my tree. Obviously, I know her, so I'm like, no, that's not a match. Or she never lived in Kansas. She was never married to this man. So you have to be very careful, because a lot of times we're looking at up information of individuals we did not know personally. So we don't know just right off the top of our heads if that information that is popping up is correct for them. You really have to do your digging and cross-checking.
And I was mentioning that to you about the name Galbraith. My father's mother had married 3 times, and the last marriage she had, her name was Edna Florence Gilbreth, Gilbreath. And so she had married John Gilbreth, and he was actually from Ethiopia. But I thought about, I knew your name was Galbraith, and I asked her, I said, well, are you related to a Gilbreth, or is that the same name and a misspelling, or could that be possible?
It could be very possible, because another thing that happens, especially on census reports, those census takers are writing down the names as they think they sound, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times, which even in with your family members, from one census report to the next, you'll see misspelling of names. It doesn't mean that they're different individuals. It could very much so be the same person. But these census takers are misspelling their names. Or maybe even some of your ancestors may not have known how to read or write. It'll tell you that on the census reports too.
Yeah.
I had some ancestors who did not know how to read or write. With that being the case, maybe they did not spell their name correctly. So you have to be careful of that too. And another interesting story. So recently I ran into someone, and this was on Super Bowl Sunday. He had on a Galbraith jersey, and I went up to him and said, hey, that's my birth name. And he was like, oh, really? That's my last name, And then he mentioned Tony Galbraith, who played for the New York Giants way back in the day. Anyway, he happens to be my dad's second cousin. And he was like, well, that's one of my cousins too. And so now here I am, like, because I don't have enough to do, I'm trying to see where our trees overlap, right? And I've gotten all the way back to the early 1800s, and we haven't overlapped yet. But an interesting find is that my ancestors with that the Galbraith last name have been in Missouri for several years. His have his ancestors with the Galbraith last name have been in North Carolina. Well, I recently just discovered that there was a slave owner with the last name Galbraith that came from North Carolina. So I'm pretty sure that's probably where our connection is. But yeah, it's a fascinating thing to be able to find, you know.
I hope our listeners are getting a good information and good context. Dr. John McClendon is back, and he has another comment. Dr. John says Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Sally was only 16 years old, right? And she came to Wilberforce, Ohio. And John knows, he's a historian as well, so he knows that story. But yeah, fascinating. No, they denied it. They denied it, but you know, you can't deny something like that. They got history to prove that, and DNA too. So, and
it was common practice. I know we're living in times where, you know, telling history may not be popular, but the truth of the matter is that that wasn't an unusual circumstance.
Thank you. Thank you again, John, for staying with us and listening. For those that are listening, be sure to like and share the program. And the more people like it, the more share, the longer we can keep the show on the air. So thank you so much for that. You know, Trish, it's really interesting when we stop and think about African Americans, Native Americans who our ancestors are. Good stories, bad stories, interesting stories. Sometimes we don't want to hear the bad stories. And one story that Dr. Henry Louis Gates tells with singer Dionne Warwick about her family, she didn't know the story, and her grandfather never told it.
We can't be certain how this catastrophe impacted the Drinkard farm. There are no records to tell us. All we know is that in 1923, Dionne's grandfather, Nitch, defaulted on a bank loan, and his family's property was sold at auction. How do you think your grandfather felt? It must have been devastating.
Oh, it had to be, you know.
Your mom was just 3 years old.
Yeah, grandfather was a proud man.
Did he ever talk about this?
No. I don't know why, but historical things of this nature that we're discussing today was never, ever mentioned or talked about.
Why do you think? Too painful?
Could possibly have been that, you know.
People think, well, if I don't tell them, why?
Why make them suffer like I did?
Yeah.
Too painful. A lot of things happen like that. People inherited a lot of land. A lot of land was stolen and taken from people. And then, you know, many people say, well, they were slaves. How did they get blamed about land? But land was given to them, and sometimes they worked it off. Sometimes they were able to make a way out of no way. And it's so sad for a lot of people to find that out.
Yeah, I mean, that's also my story in Missouri, my maternal line. We're talking about around 400 acres of land. I'm still researching that. I don't know how they lost it, but they had it. And somehow it was either taken or they lost it or what have you. And it's sad to know, you know, that Black people are losing that amount of massive land. Can we really, if we look at it, can we really see how much that could have impacted us financially if we still had those levels of land in our families? I mean, even today, the wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans, is a really big gap even today. I know a lot of people will say that racism no longer exists, but when we're talking about, and I believe, I looked at this recently. Do your own research, but I believe that white Americans have about 70% more wealth than Black Americans. When we're talking about huge wealth gaps like that, that makes a huge difference in how our families are able to move forward even today. So yeah, it's very sad to hear any Black family from generations ago when they lose that amount of land.
But you know, a lot of people are probably listening and saying, well, with all the turmoil going on in Washington, D.C., people losing their jobs, and you're sitting up here talking about family history, Black history. Does that make sense, Trish, to you that we're talking about Black history at this time when the country is going to crazy?
Because we're creating Black history now. We are Black history. What we're living in right now and the moments we're going through, this is the history that our descendants are going to be talking about. And it's important to know where we came from. One, because if we don't want to repeat the atrocities that happened to us as a people, we need to understand what those are. And even when it's painful to look at, we still need to look. And because if we don't look and pay attention and understand what's there, then guarantee we're at risk of repeating it.
A lot of people in our family, on my mom's side, like I said, that family history has really been researched and really uncovered a lot of information. But that's in the first generation. My parents, she had 10 brothers and sisters, so that's been researched. They know it. We know it. I'm in that second level. I know it. But then our children, some of our children know it, but then the others who get married, what about their side of their families? Maybe a girl cousin, but they know nothing about their husband's family. So they have to get up off the fact that, well, we know our family history. No, you don't, because you don't know your husband's family of origin. You don't know who they are. So it's time for you all to get up and start looking, and don't rely on and leave what's been uncovered as a fact for everybody. It's not. Don't let this time go by. Time is going by so quick. We never know. I might not be here tomorrow.
Yeah,
so we have to get this information out, y'all.
It's so important. And, I fear too that the generation today, maybe they're losing interest in things of this nature. I would hope not. I know me personally, out of my 4 children, I have that one who's definitely not going to lose any. She's going to inherit the family history, right? She's going to be the one. You can already see she's 13 and she just loves everything about history and our family history. So I think it's very important to pinpoint that person that's going to carry on the torch, right? And hold the family story, and make sure that the story is carried on to the next generation, because no one wants their story or their family's history wiped out. It's important to carry it on into the future because it tells us who we are as a people, who we are as a family, who we are as an individual. And those things matter, because if we don't carry it on, you're going to get to that person again. Like I've seen so many times, that person who's broken because they don't know their identity. They don't know who they are. And when you don't know who you are, it's easy for other people to tell you who you are. And it's important to really give your children that piece of information.
Indeed, that is so true. Well, we have gone over our time limit, but that's okay. You stay with us for a moment longer. If you still have a burning question or comment, you should get out of chat line. We'd like to hear from you very soon. So while we're still on the air, what comes first? Is it getting the DNA kit and getting the DNA tested first, or is it going to the website and beginning to trace the family root?
I think it all depends on personal preference. Me personally, I did start the family tree first before taking a DNA test. And then I probably first took a DNA test. Oh, it's been a lot of years. My first DNA test was with Ancestry.com. And because I'm so heavily in this now, I've taken multiple DNA tests through multiple companies, just because I like to do that comparison. And when I tell you, I've tested everyone in my family, in my immediate family. I've encouraged extended family members to get tested. I've even tested our dogs. When I tell you I'm that heavy into DNA testing, it's the truth. But yeah, it all comes down to personal preference. I see people on my channel who will say, forget about DNA testing, follow the paper trail. Well, yeah, follow the paper trail all you want. And that's fine. It's very important. But don't be surprised, though, that you discover that some of those people in your paper trail aren't biologically related to you. It happens, right? It's been happening since the beginning of time. Yeah, and that's why so many people, even today, when they do take those DNA tests, they're discovering things they never knew about themselves. Maybe they're discovering a parent they never knew, a grandparent. My husband happened to be one of them when he took a DNA test, and discovered that the man that he was told was his grandfather, there was no way possible that man could be his grandfather. And, so that surprise, and not only that, but to show that his biggest ancestry percentage didn't come from a country in Africa, but came from Poland. So it's family secrets. Sometimes, the elderly people don't want to share their secrets. They will take it to the grave. They will try to. But with these DNA kits, it's uncovering some things.
Some people are ashamed of some of the things that happened in the past, but it is what it is, and it will definitely come out at some point. Somebody find out. Somebody will get that, and it's that information hard, or not hard, to talk with your family and share information and share stories as you sit down at dinner. Family reunions are great times to share information. So Trish is still here. Our screen kind of going blank, but we're going to wrap up in just a minute. Still here. So as we get ready to close off the show, any closing comments for people?
I would just encourage everyone.
Do you have any closing comments?
Yes. I would say don't feel intimidated. Don't feel overly intimidated. Just take what you know and go ahead and get started. A lot of people want to, even if you don't feel comfortable doing the DNA testing, that's fine, because not everyone wants to share their DNA with companies. I get it, However, I will say this though. Black people are very underrepresented in the DNA testing community. What that means is that you're going to find less matches, and it's harder to gather that history in the DNA testing when Black people are fearful to share their DNA. So the more of us who do decide to test, the more information they'll be able to put together. But anyway, I do get why some Black people don't want to do it, and that's fine. But you can start with your family tree. You can start today. I personally use Ancestry.com. They don't pay me to say this, but it's just a large database. And and it's worth it to start doing some digging. It's very important information that you want your future generations to have. So I would highly recommend go ahead and get started. And it may not be as overwhelming as you think.
No, most DNA kits cost between $99 to $59. Some companies are having specials this month because of Black History Month, so that might be something that people might find interesting. So how much would it cost for you if you hired a DNA or a genealogist, say? A genealogist, say, you say, well, I don't have time to do all that research. I'm going to hire somebody. What would something like that average cost for someone to do the research for you?
I think it all depends. It could cost several hundred to even thousands of dollars, depending on who you want to hire. I would be careful, though, if you do go that route, because there are a lot of people out there who say that they're genealogists, and perhaps they're not as experienced as you think. And perhaps also a lot of them are using the same tools that we already talked about here that you can use yourself if you have the time to do it. So if you do decide to use a genealogist, I would recommend have them send some samples of their work, of trees they've put together. Make sure that they've been in it for a while. Make sure that, what they, their background matches with what you're looking for, so it's important to do that.
Are there certified genealogists or companies that you can go to find genealogists that are certified?
I'm pretty sure there are. There aren't any that I'm going to recommend here. I would say do your own research, right?
Right.
Definitely do your own research. But for me, I would personally try to start on your own, even if you just have the one weekend. Give it one weekend to see what you can uncover. And then if you're still having trouble and it's not looking the way you want, go ahead and, if you have the money to do so, go ahead and invest in it. And happy digging, because you're going to be in for a ride there. You're going to find some things that are going to fascinate you and some things that will make you want to cry. But it's all, really good to have, really good information to know.
I don't know where you find the time to do all of your research and all the work that you do, being that you're a wife, a mother, and a business owner, and still you find time to do your videos and do the genealogy research. You're a busy lady.
Oh my gosh. I mean, let me tell you something. Some nights when I can't sleep, I've never shared this, but what I'll do is I'll go on and start building family trees. I know this, I'm not obsessed, but when it's one of your hobbies, right? So I really do enjoy it. But yeah, it could be time consuming. And thankfully for my channel and the work that I'm doing, I'm starting to expand the team. So I am in the interview process of finding researchers, partnering with genealogists and others who can take some of the workload off of me. So you're going to start seeing that on the channel as well. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Indeed, indeed. So as a psychologist that studies the social life of people and all the issues of DNA research and all of that, how do you find yourself and the work that you do really fitting in with the history and family research?
Well, a lot of times it's interesting that you say that. I try to take my discoveries and then also my educational background and say, well, why do they do things like this? Really trying to understand, why does society operate like this? Why do these group of people, and just having that background of studying human nature, it helps in putting these stories together. It does. It doesn't take away the fact that sometimes these stories are overwhelming and so sad to hear, and sometimes I have to separate myself and just be the researcher, that's just researching this information so I can put the story together. Otherwise it could get to be too overwhelming, but I think it's important to continue to share these stories and the history that we have, because what we're talking about here is not just Black history. It's not just our family history. We're talking about American history. We're talking about American identity. And because of that, I think it's important work to continue.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show, sharing your time with us this afternoon. And for people that are looking for Dr. Trish Varner, it's Varner. She's on Facebook. She's on Instagram. She's on TikTok. She's on YouTube. And where else are you, Dr. Trish? Did I name everything yet?
Yeah, I think you mentioned Instagram too. Yeah. I try to post weekly on my YouTube channel, and that's where you'll find the DNA stories. Also, I've recently started doing home life with Dr. Trish for those of you who are really interested in what my day-to-day life may look like. So if you're interested in that, follow also on Instagram and also on TikTok, Home Life with Dr. Trish.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Trish. We really appreciate you. We'll be looking out for you. And thank you all for joining us on Trish's and Opinions with your host, Edna Howell-Parrish. It's always Straight Talk Life.